Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
Thursday! Battle of the Monster Trucks! Marcus, we made it to Thursday!
I don't have to audio edit that at all, a little bit down. Jesus Christ!
Why am I so excited, Marcus? We did 4 podcast recordings in 4 days. And 4 amazing authors.
Yeah, it was a horror week in terms of amount of work, but it was absolutely, every day had something great in it. It was some really good stuff. And all of that will come out pretty close to our 50th episode very soon.
Oh, Rob, that's going to be a real achievement. We're all looking forward to that. We hope you, as our listeners, are looking forward to that. But Marcus, enough about us blowing our own horn. Who's on the show today?
Well, today we're talking to Dr. Grace Lordan, who is an assistant professor at the London School of Economics, and her book, Think Big. What were your insights on that one?
Yeah, she told some really interesting stories. And I liked the opener story that she kind of had a real wake-up call at, I don't think it was LSE. I think it was an earlier part in her career where she had a mentor advisor that said, look, it's going to be 5 years before you even become anything. And she kind of walked around with a cartoon cloud over her head until she woke up and said, I don't have to believe him. Just because he said it doesn't make it true. And I really loved that. The other thing that we talked about today is not necessarily related to Think Big, but it's all part of our interview, was the concept of psychological safety and how it's being misused as a word. And yet diversity and inclusion of ideas is really important. So she was talking about how do you create a team that can openly argue and debate, but when the decision is made, everyone pulls together and follows the same culture and gets behind execution. So I think that she covers a whole lot. She brings a lot of psychology in without making it too thick and too heavy. She focuses on individual actions and individual goals, but she comes from a corporate space. So she was a really great interviewer. But enough of my rambling, Marcus. What were your takeaways?
Yes, so this was our second book on behavioral psychology or behavioral science. If not, we scratched probably similar principles in other books, but this one was quite a focus. And there's a lot in this book about different biases and so on. The one I quite took away from it, and that has a lot to do with me because I overthink at times, or I'm very internal, how much to spend on these internal plannings. Because as you said, sometimes that creates a bias inside of yourself. The story you're telling yourself often holds you back from things. And that might also come from the outside because people tell you certain things and then you start internalizing these stories. So it was interesting what she said about balancing that. So it's good to reflect internally and maybe recognize that not everything people say is actually coming from the right place and true. And the other thing is also that you should ask people outside and take that in and maybe see yourself in a different light and maybe stop believing certain things you might have thought about that hold you back. So it's a fine balance, but in the book there's about 10 different things about that. And it's really great because I think it gives you a lot of different tools to get out of that routine, out of that way of thinking that might hold you back. So I really loved that kind of internal, external bias balance to get to your big idea and take a step towards it. I really love that one.
Yeah, really good. Good insights from you, good insights from me, good author on the show today. But enough of our kind of rambling, Marcus. What should we do?
Let's go to that interview. Hello, everyone. Today we're here with Grace Lordan. Hello, Grace, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Marcus. I'm really excited to be here.
Lovely. So I said just lovely again. And I will say it probably 100 times. So there we go. This was the first time. We start at the top as usual. So please tell our listeners who you are and why you wrote the book.
So I'm Grace Lorden. I'm an associate professor in behavioural science from the London School of Economics and director of the Inclusion Initiative. I wrote Think Big because I used to give a lot of talks in corporate companies where I would speak about behavioural biases that employees have, and particular how it caused gaps between, men and women, and people of different ethnicities and other underrepresented groups. And usually when I would give these talks, I would talk about the biases and then what you do about it. And it was all at the firm level. So all firm policies. But of course, the audience in those talks tends to be much younger. You might get one or two senior leaders. So very often I would get the question, look, that's lovely, but what can I do with this advice? It doesn't really help me. I'm not the CEO. So Think Big is really about for people who are trying to navigate a career, regardless of what they're doing. They don't necessarily have any power. So it's about kind of taking control over what you can control.
So the word career is an interesting word for me at where I am in my life. My sister-in-law said to me about 2 years ago, where do you want to go with your career? I said, my career is over. I don't have a career anymore. What I have is an income plan. And so I liked some of your Think Big ideas, but I've taken them out of the career context. So do you think that you can take those kind of ideas and move them out of the career kind of box and use them for bigger things and bigger initiatives?
So when I wrote it initially, it was written with careers in mind, the traditional career. And when I was drawing on examples, a lot of them were about entrepreneurs, people with side hustles, thinking of biases in ways for people outside the traditional career path. And actually the name changed from Build the Career That You Want to Build the Future You Want for exactly that reason. So I love the idea of people picking it up who are miserable at work, not quitting their job and doing a side hustle that allows them to expand. I love somebody picking it up and saying, actually, the traditional career path isn't for me. I'm going to use these tools to create something untraditional that I'm going to actually love. So absolutely, absolutely. And you and my publishers agree on that it should be future rather than career.
It's great when publishers agree with something. So in that sense, so tell us a little bit about one thing you mentioned in your book, and there's lots of things to be mentioned, which is Me Plus. Tell us about Me Plus, please.
So Me Plus is this idea of your future self. So I think one of the big differences between Think Big and other books that talk about building futures is we talk a lot about the idea that you need to be thinking a decent amount of time in the future, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, rather than doing something that manages you to reinvent yourself within a week. So Me Plus then is you visualizing what you want your future self to actually be. And I think another difference between my approach and other approaches is that I don't ask people to pick a career label. I don't ask people to pick a lifestyle. I don't ask people to kind of pick an end of the path in the way that you can give it a name. I ask them to reflect on the activities that they enjoy doing on a day-to-day basis, and then think about what type of jobs will allow you to do more of those activities. And the Me Plus then is about thinking about, okay, these are the activities I like. So what does Me Plus look like? What are they doing if I'm as successful as I can be doing those activities?
Yeah, and I know it's really terrible to even mention, but I will. 4 Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss. And when he's talking about the idea, he's like, okay, when you only have a 4 hour work week, what are you going to do in the other time that you used to be at work? And visualizing what that end state is key to creating an environment where you kind of open your mind to create that kind of an end environment. So I really like that you kind of pulled on that same thing. And it's another reason of saying, why do I want to do that? What is my why? So what do you think? Is that the right way to go about that, or is there more to it than just the why?
I think the why is really important. So connecting to the meaning, and in Think Big, if you're I kind of say if you're somebody who really values money, then that's absolutely okay to be aiming for something that is high income. If you're somebody who really values spending time with your family, it's absolutely okay to be aiming for the 4 hour work week, or 4 day work week. 4 hour work week would be wonderful, actually. But I think what's different about what I say and kind of what Tim says, even though I don't think he would disagree if we were to have this conversation, is I really want people thinking about what are the tasks that they'll do when they're actually working. So the kind of day-to-day grind, imagining what those actually look like. So, thinking about that you're only going to work 4 days a week is fantastic. But when you are working those 4 days a week, which is a long time, what are you going to actually be doing? So that it is something that you're passionate about. and brings you happiness. And, in my job, they haven't given me a retirement kind of deadline. So if I have to be stuck doing things at 80 years of age, I really want to actually, enjoy them. And I think it's possible now for us to craft work in a way, if we're really mindful about what we actually enjoy, to get us to that end goal quicker than we might have actually expected.
Yeah, it seems that I think all of us have to eventually aim at a US presidential kind of age of work, going way into our 70s, doesn't it? But on that level, in how we go about these things, and for obvious reasons, there's a lot of behavioral science in the book, and we got very excited about that. I mean, my background is more design thinking, service design, but behavior is very, very close, sitting very close to that. And we had a really, really great chat with Richard Chataway on one of our first episodes we had. Tell us a little bit about what behavioral science teaches us, and maybe how much of a behavioral scientist you need to be in order to apply some of the propositions you have in the book for us.
So I think if you come to LSE, one of the first things you learn in a behavioral science class is that we have two different thinking styles. And this comes, directly from Danny Kahneman's work, where he says it's not right that we weigh up the costs, benefits, and risk of every decision like economists say that we do, but rather there's sometimes when we're thinking fast, it's really impulsive, we're on autopilot, we're operating with our unconscious mind. And then there's these other periods of time when we're slow and we're acting deliberately. So a lot of the biases that people might have heard about with cute names kind of sit in that first kind of part of thinking where I'm working very fast and I'm on autopilot. I think the interesting thing is that if you look at the kind of estimates of how we spend our time switching between these thinking modes, it's 80 to 90% in that kind of fast, autopilot mode. And if you imagine that you're going through your day, you're going through your work day, whatever that might be, and you're making decisions that ultimately affect your future, because how we spend our time, which is our most precious resource, is ultimately what determines our future. Think Big is really about getting you to notice when those decisions matter. So you switch to system 2. So you switch to kind of slowing down and thinking deliberately. And how I do that in Think Big is really to kind of anchor this idea of you need to identify small steps, because we know as behavioral scientists that these small steps taken regularly that develop into habits have disproportionate effect on large outcomes. And it's really about bringing that into career focus. And I think specific to Think Big, you don't need to have any behavioral science background in order to read it. So, I really introduce the biases in ways where even if you never read another behavioral science book again, it should be very easy for you to digest. And if it isn't, you absolutely should write a complaint letter, because I worked very hard to get it to that level, I can tell you.
So we see a lot of things about auto driving or autonomous driving cars. And when you were talking about operating in the fast mode, operating in the unconscious mind, is there any way that we should be thinking about of upgrading our autonomous driving? How can we upgrade our system 1 thinking, if nothing else, to identify when we need to move to slow thinking?
I think it's a great question. So I think one of the biggest mistakes our students make when they come into LSE is they assume that the autopilot is a bad place to be. And it actually isn't, once you're making decisions that you've made many times before. So you've been able to learn by doing. So you're very safe in that space. So what you need to then think about is, how can I get actions embedded in my life, so embedded in my routine, that are done with system 1, that fast brain. And why that's important is because if you really are trying to invoke this kind of deliberate style of thinking all the time, firstly, you're probably going to fail. But even if you succeed, it's really, really draining. It's really, really mentally taxing. And there's actually evidence in behavioral science to suggest, and the bias for people who are interested is called ego depletion, that if I really deliberately think about one thing for a concentrated period of time, some other domain in my life is actually going to fall over. So I think the trick is thinking about, what do I want to make automatic? And it might be for a small period of time, you need to slow down and you need to really push yourself to kind of do activities that you wouldn't necessarily do before. But making those part of yourself, I think, is the key to being successful in the future.
Well, this sounds quite similar to some of the principles applied to learning and some of the insights there, isn't it? Where you basically exercise, but then a lot of the learning or the heavier work seemingly happens when you step back, look at, so what have I just done? Have I done the right thing or other thing? Should I nudge it a bit? Should I shift it a bit? And then go back to doing that. Is that sort of a similar principle or concept, you
Yeah.
would say?
Yeah, it's a great analogy. And I'm not somebody who journals or spends like huge amounts of time sitting around kind of self-reflecting on the things that I've done. But I do that now routinely in a week, every single Sunday night, for exactly the reason that you described. So, you go through your week and you try to make kind of really good decisions about how, you spend your time. So I'm really happy. I know on Sunday night, I won't label this podcast as a mistake because I'm enjoying it. But there's probably other things in my week that I've got sucked into that I think I need to make sure that I don't do that again. It didn't help me. It didn't help other people. And actually, I think the modern society creates what has been called busy work by many people. And that's really what you want to try to avoid. So then kind of coming at it, as you say, in the same way that you might do if you're learning, and figuring out where you are so that you reset any mistakes that you're making for the next week is important.
You use one of my least favorite words in that last little monologue.
What's it?
Busy. Because so many people, I'm busy. And suddenly it's become fashionable to be busy, and suddenly if you're not busy, then you don't have near as much value. And I think it's a real shame that whole kind of focus is around, oh, I'm so busy. Well, that just means you don't know how to manage your time if you're that busy.
I agree. And I talk about the idea of time sinkers in the book and classifying our time in these three different types of things. The ones that don't give any value to me and to anybody else. The ones that give value to me in the moment, which I'm a sucker for, I have to say, but give me nothing in the future. So, kind of eating nice meals, watching Netflix, that kind of stuff. You still want to do it, but not as much. And then what actually kind of builds you up and allows you to have a good future. But I agree with you. I even showed my own time audit and Think Big, and it was quite scary how much time I wasted just checking emails, bizarre things. And I felt really busy. And I take my feeling about this idea that we're really busy is that it's a narrative that we kind of tell ourselves to keep ourselves inside our comfort zone, in the same way the narrative, I'm not good enough, or that isn't something that I could do, or they won't accept me. I think I'm too busy really does allow you to actually say no to opportunities that might make you feel quite uncomfortable. So it's handy, but it's not going to help you build a future.
So I've got a two-part kind of follow-on to that. You were talking about kind of the internal narrative and kind of the stories that we tell ourselves. And that's kind of the bias that we have internally. You also talk about bias that is external, other people's bias and how that impacts us. And you use cognitive bias. And I like the word cognitive dissonance. And I think a lot of times I can't hold two ideas in my head that are diametrically opposed. And I think when it comes to me trying to set goals, I have to decide which one of these ideas have I made up and which one of these ideas is true. But what do you think about cognitive dissonance as it relates to goal setting?
Well, it comes in handy because I guess by the time you've set a goal, you'll be able to convince yourself that you actually set the right goal. So in that sense, having cognitive dissonance, it can actually work for you and allow you to sleep at night. But I think it's a battle. I think it's a battle in the same way that we have to constantly battle the tendency for confirmation bias, and just kind of getting the same advice that confirms our beliefs. And when you kind of think about the world of work, regardless of what you're doing, one of the best things that you can actually do from yourself is really challenge yourself in actually maybe choosing to shoot for something that's diametrically opposed to what you thought might actually suit you, and seeing whether or not that hat actually fits you. Because we have these narratives about ourselves, and until we step out of them, we're never going to get disconfirming evidence. But I think if you're not brave enough to kind of take that on, I think one of the best things that you can actually do is seek out people who really think differently to you. And that's only something that I've really done in the last 5 years, to be honest. I think up to then, I think if you met my friends, they would look diverse on the outside. But actually, if you saw us having a meal and overheard the conversation, we all agree with each other and propped ourselves up. And there's goodness in that. You need some of that in your life. But having people who disagree with you and will really give you different opinions has been, it is extremely valuable, both for decision makers in large organizations. But I think as individuals, it's the best way, not just to move us forward, but to allow us see opportunities that we're blind to.
Yeah. And there's something there. And so interesting thing is that I'm a little bit different to Troy, which is probably why we have this amazing dynamic during the podcast here. But so I like to run multiple things at the same time. So for me to fix on one thing is a problem, right? Because I always like to look at 4 or 5 different things at a time, and I let them sort of flow a bit and let more information come in. And eventually something will crystallize and say, well, okay, let's shoot at this now. And sometimes then there's not a lot of time left maybe to do so. But so that then gets me, for example, in a very situation where you say, right, how much is there then a balance? So now I'm drilling there a little bit of more into what you just said. So figuring out to make a decision yourself, talking to other people, knowing that when people talk to you, there's potential bias that comes with it, or you have a bias internally. How easy is it to say this is sort of the right balance to strike when you say, maybe a little bit like when you go out and you do user research and you have, let's say, a good average number is like talk to 5 people and talk to their stories, and you get a really good spread without getting the same answer, but you're not getting too diverse without being able to see a tendency. Is there something there the same with the decision making to plan your path to develop your Me Plus?
I mean, I think on people who think differently, if you have 3 people who are independent, who don't know each other, and they think differently, I think that's good enough. And I think anything extra is a bonus. So I think, 3 is a trend. So if you end up getting advice from 3 independent people that's going in the same direction, then you've probably hit something really, really useful, right? I think, the approach that you described and how you work, I think it's quite common actually that people have kind of a number of things that are actually running along in the same kind of in a direction. And I think if you have good habits embedded in kind of thinking about your future already, that can work really, really well. I think for people who've been stuck for a long time, whether or not they've hit unemployment or they've hit a rush or they've been plateaued, starting with one thing and really aiming for that and embedding those small steps, because I don't think it's necessarily even about the goal that you're shooting for. I think it's about the ability to be able to design your routines, actually, that you have steps that are moving you towards something that's positive in your future. And if you get that down once, I think being able to do it 4 or 5, even 10 times, depending on your personality, can work really, really well. The thought processes that you describe, Marcus, I mean, they help me in the sense that some of my biggest breakthroughs have been when I've had if I'm sleeping, I'll go to sleep thinking about a problem, and then I wake up and I'll actually have some ideas about how to solve it. Rarely I sit down at my desk and I have a brainwave. I'm sitting down at my desk and I'm doing those routine tasks, writing up ideas that I've had already. And, you might call that creativity, but it isn't actually where my creative moments have come from, down to the kind of boring administrative tasks that we'd all love to give away.
We had an interview with an author about 6 books ago, and they said true diversity is absolutely a diversity of opinions and not just diversity of kind of whether it's ethnicity or whether it's sexuality or whatever it is. And a lot of big companies don't understand that level of diversity, that they would hire someone that thinks fundamentally differently, because they're trying to balance that with maintaining consistency of a company culture, which needs some level of kind of symbiosis. And so it's getting that balance right.
I think it's problematic in the sense as well that if you're kind of a leader of a meeting or a leader of an organization, you want people to always back your opinions. So kind of moving to then a style where you're embracing dissent for the brainstorming phase, but the team is well connected enough to actually back you once you make the decision whether or not they agree. I think is a skill that too few of our leaders actually have, because you need both. You need the culture that you describe where everyone's coming together. But I think to innovate, and this is where we're kind of falling over, I think in a lot of industries, to innovate, we do need to be arguing with each other and be comfortable. And this word, which is starting to drive me crazy, psychological safety, because everyone loves it, but no one knows how to kind of define it properly, or even how that we actually get there. But if that concept that will be familiar to your listeners is where you want to be. So if I have an argument with you now, I know actually later we'll go for dinner. We won't be worried about it. There's no threat to my job. And creating that culture is really, really hard.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a lot of the work I do. And yeah, it's interesting that when you have a design background, these things are actually pretty normal. You really have you just throw 100 ideas out all the time, and you just poke them and do that. And that sort of, for designers, is quite common. It's been common for decades. I think for a lot of other practices and other people in organizations, it's sort of interesting that organizations want, as you said, they want to become like that a little bit more, but often governance and other structural elements prevent that. But generally, there's now that we're already here, there is a parallel between developing the Me Plus and applying that to individuals and organizations, if not teams. Can you see some obvious parallels there that work with that, where you could scale this up or apply it in the same way, or do you think just you could just apply it to a whole team and they would all go through the same thing and that would work? So is that something you had in mind when you wrote the book, or you generally just see that?
So, yes, I mean, so now that I'm thinking about it, it wasn't what I had in mind when I wrote the book, because I was really trying to go the other way around, to move from thinking about firm policies to the individual. Since I launched the book, I've done a lot of talks in companies. And people have kind of pointed out that, some of the tools are really good actually for them to give to their team members. And one, which I think is a really good example, I speak a lot about feedback in the book and the ability not just to be able to actively listen and take feedback, but ask for the feedback that you need. And in most corporate companies, we teach people how to give feedback. So, I'm taught about how to give feedback to my team members. No one's ever talked to me about how do I actually go and ask for the feedback that I actually need in my career. And if you think about it, if they taught me how to ask for the feedback that I need and to nudge the manager into kind of the area that I really need to develop, we might be in a better place, because it's a big ask to ask managers who are managing 10, 20, 50, 60 people to individualize and personalize all their feedback. So giving that autonomy, I think, back to the individual allows for the creation of better teams. In my own work at the moment, one thing that I'm really interested in for culture, and maybe actually both of you will have kind of some thoughts on this, is the idea of tipping. So, usually in organizations, they talk a lot about top down. So it needs to be tone at the top, it trickles down, which I think works under kind of a standard standing ovation model in behavioral science. But of course, a lot of times when ideas take on, it's through tipping. So the idea that we could teach people who are in the mid-level of the organization, who are normally actually kind of ignored when it comes to kind of leadership training, how to guide their teams to be inclusive, to embrace dissent, and to get to kind of that nice, the new status quo that we spoke about earlier, where we're arguing in the brainstorming session and agreeing when it's the go forward moment. And whether you'd create tipping of a culture through an organization if you've got enough mid-level managers involved. Because I guess if I'm a mid-level manager and I look at your team and it's performing really, really well because you're embracing dissent, then I'm going to adopt the strategy that you're doing. And I think Big directly speaks to that. For these managers who have small teams, can get to know the people, it can help them get the best out at that level, for sure.
And we talk about managing up. And I think that's a really good example of, if you're in the middle, doing it right, and then setting by example how things can be done. And we had David Marquet on, which we really, really enjoyed having David on the show. And he was talking about the fact he was a nuclear submarine captain. And he inverted the command and control kind of authoritarian naval mandate for management and pushed all the decisions down to the people who actually had the data and had the ability to make the right decisions, and it really revolutionized a lot of the way things operate. And it's been an excellent book. Sadly, we're in one of those crazy situations like we always find ourselves, where we've got more questions than we have time. So we're going to do one last question, and it's a personal story from me. I have been wanting to start an online store for probably more than 10 years. And I've done the entire thinking about it. I know what the revenue numbers need to be, and I've kind of mapped everything out. And there are tons and tons of these kind of marketing projects that are out there that can do this, but it's all about finding the exact right product. And that's the part that always seems to be the essence of, if you don't get that right, nothing else will work right. And you talk about the very beginning of your book about setting goals. And if you're 40 and you want to be a professional rugby player, it's probably not a realistic goal, and there are a few other examples. I won't reveal them all because we want our listeners to read your book. But how do you get yourself grounded in reality and still thinking big?
I think that's the key. It again comes back to the small steps. So I think it needs to be when you think big. The second part, they put the think big in big font, which is really important because it probably helps sell books because it's a really cool cover. But when you think big, identifying the small steps that allow you get to that goal is really, really important. And of course, if you're 40 and you want to be a professional rugby player, you'll fast discover that there aren't small steps that will actually get there. Lucky for you with the online store, you probably will get there, right? So it's a matter of identifying the product. And the only thing that I would say, which you probably might have thought about already, is don't also kind of dismiss the role of narrative in this, because I think so many entrepreneurs have fantastic products, right? But we never actually get to see them because the storytelling around the product isn't necessarily there. And the reverse of it, there's lots of crappy products that sell an awful lot because they have this really kind of cool story around it. But it's about identifying the small steps and really being ambitious. And I think the other part of it is kind of maybe there's some people who've plateaued for a number of years and they have this big thinking goal that feels very far out of reach. But maybe you can get small steps and it just will take a bit longer. It might take you 5 years, but so what? I think we can do huge changes in our lives in 5 years. And by the way, I've committed on another podcast that I did to start a business at 45. So I think I have 5 years now to actually think about the product that you're puzzling over at the moment. But identifying those small steps is really worth the thought, actually. That construction phase is very important.
Great. Well, it's been a real joy having you on the show today. We enjoyed reading your book. We wish you great success. Have you got any other books coming up or not yet?
Not yet. I mean, I have to say I really enjoyed writing the book, but then the editing was quite torturous. So it's going to take me a while to actually forget about it so that it actually goes back into the back of my mind. 2 to 3 years, I think, for the next one. But for me, it's been an absolute pleasure, Marcus and Troy. I've really enjoyed being here today and I really appreciate it.
Well, Marcus, of course, wrote the book. So Marcus, I'll let you have the closing remarks.
This was a nice talk with very big insights, and we thank you all for that. So thank you again for your time, Grace. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.